Same title, AI and its Discontents. Shunryu received over 60 proposed papers for that special edition. And I reached out to him afterwards to see if maybe he'd like to collaboratively edit another publication in the field of an anthology with the papers that could not be included in his special issue. So he assisted with me with the initial crafting of the proposal. I later took over as lead editor. We invited other contributors to participate based on the proposals that were sent in, and soon we had confirmed 12 chapters. And that's how I've positioned this anthology, building explicitly on Shunryu's work as a jumping off point. As I see it, there's this multidisciplinary, though distinct field of AI questioning and resistance that merits its own unification. And there's also a long history of critique, both from within and outside the field of AI development. The gap, for example, between the STEM fields and the social sciences and humanities fields is often noted. And I think reconnecting these approaches will foster not only greater dialogue amidst the social sciences, humanities, and programmers, but also concert our efforts to propose new political futures alongside the advancement and infusion of AI technology into our daily lives. So the book represents one venue where so many unique perspectives are brought together. Among the commitments of this burgeoning subfield are the contours of critical theory, joining the historical development of AI with projects that imagine and are actually doing emancipatory projects. The book provides readers with a range of conceptual and analytic tools, not only for questioning AI, but also presenting alternatives to its current trajectory across nations and sites of practice and AI infusion. The essays are organized around 5 themes, but they're definitely not mutually exclusive. Posthumanism, human values, media and language, governance, and resistance. And I think readers will really enjoy learning about all kinds of things, as I did, as I had the privilege of editing this collection, such as automated justice in China, COVID-19 health apps in India, which we'll hear about today, the role of AI in app upgrades and the internet, as well as AI's use in labor and robotics, even nanorobotics, AI frameworks and bioethics, child-adult relations, the human tendency to anthropomorphize neural networks, as we'll hear about today, the use of language and Google Translate, as we'll hear about today, and so many others related to AI and its responsibility, as we're going to hear about today. So now to introduce you to the contributors who have joined us, we have 4 people, and I'm going to introduce them each alphabetically. So first up, we have Avon Huxor, who is an associate lecturer in the Department of Computer Science at the University of Exeter. Avon started working in artificial intelligence in the mid-1980s, leading to his PhD a decade later, in which he first argued that AI is a form of writing. The impact of the AI winter led him to move into astrophysics, and he worked there as an observation astronomer for 15 years. The rise of new AI encouraged him to return to AI and machine learning. So welcome, thanks for joining us, Avon. Next up, we have Ranjini Raghavendra, who's a domain lead in open data research at the Center for Open Data Research Public Affairs Center in Bengaluru. She was also a Mellon Sawyer Fellow in the Histories of Artificial Intelligence, Genealogies of Power, which took place in Cambridge in the United Kingdom. She's presently working closely with the planning development in Karnataka on sustainable development goals. The overarching theme that connects her work has been the use of data for action, information, and communication technologies for health and development at different levels in government, from grassroots to the State Department in India. So welcome, Ranjini. Next up, we have Scott Schwartz, who is an anthropologist working on the material culture of knowledge production. Particularly, they focus on how the quantification of environments normalizes ecological exploitation and colonizes imaginaries. They are an adjunct professor at the City University of New York, and they're a visiting fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology. Welcome, Scott. And finally, we have Stephanie Allman. Stephanie Allman is a postdoctoral research associate on the project Giving Voice to Digital Democracies, the Social Impact of Artificially Intelligent Communications Technologies. This is based at CRASSH at the University of Cambridge. She holds a PhD in linguistics from the University of Marburg in Germany, and her most recent work has focused on quarantining online hate speech, misinformation, gender bias in machine translation, dynamic data statements, and exploring counter-speech approaches to fighting harmful content. Welcome, Stephanie. Okay, so I'll tell you a little bit about the format as I envisioned it for this celebratory event. It's a talk show. This is the idea. Is I really wanted to get you who've arrived here to be interested in not only what each individual contribution has to say, but also thinking about it as an actual conversation, this creation of a venue or a kind of subfield in which we can learn from each other and our projects, how what we have studied can actually become in conversation across disciplinary boundaries and borders. So what I'm going to invite each speaker to do momentarily is to introduce their work and their contribution in only a few minutes. So we're being very strict about that 3-minute rule, to kind of like a 3-minute thesis about your chapter. And tell us a little bit about what are those key points, like what are the takeaway? Like let's get people interested in thinking about their own research and its place within the volume. Then in the spirit of these kind of general aims, that consolidation and interdisciplinary conversation, I'm going to put the authors into conversation with each other, and I will lead a few different questions that will do exactly that. Next will be your turn. We'll invite the contributors to first maybe potentially ask each other a few questions. And of course, then it is also your turn to shine as people who have arrived to help us celebrate this launch. So if you would like to ask a question, as I mentioned at the start, please don't hesitate to put it in the chat. If you are an early career researcher or if you are a student, please do indicate that, because I would like to promote those voices as I keep stack and prepare to invite you to ask your question. You can also just write your question in the chat if you would prefer for me to read it aloud. And if it's for one specific speaker, please do indicate that. Okay, so first up, let's think about those different chapters, and I'm going to invite people based on the order that they are in the book. So, you know, mixing things up one more time. So the first chapter that appears in terms of the kind of layout of the outline of the chapters is Scott Schwartz, who wrote about dumb waiters and smartphones, the responsibility of intelligence. So Scott, please give us a few thoughts and key points about your chapter.
Oh yeah, thanks, Ariane. My chapter explores this relationship between responsibility, technology, language. I'm trying to reframe AI thus far as something more like an artificial responsibility than intelligence. This thing we're trying to invent, it's not so much a technology for reproducing or surpassing human intelligence, but for my premise, relieving a sort of neoliberalized responsibility for capitalized exploitation. My claim, AI is part of a historic arc of technology, sort of growing out of a humanist classical liberalism, which puts the weight of the world on individual humans and their reasoning. Unfortunately, this is kind of burdensome. It means we, Enlightenment liberal humans, are responsible for the genocides of the past 500 years, 300 years, responsible for the 6th great extinction, climate change. And this past centuries of technological history are this effort to sort of absolve colonizers of responsibility. It's my approach. So technology is kind of a responsibility surrogate. AI, with its promise of surpassing human reasoning, is optimistically, designed to solve the disasters of industrialized exploitation, but perhaps pessimistically to blame for these disasters. The smarter we render these decision-making artifacts, the easier they are to blame for not knowing better. Discussing the dumbwaiter as this food service technology. In my chapter, I point to language, its role in perceived intelligence. this mute technology, the dumbwaiter can't be held responsible. But as technologies become more communicative, they take on more responsibility. The contingent dynamics of language seems to be a benchmark for achieving some level of intelligence. But the thing about language is that it thrives on mistakes. Language is sort of biological, and biological things have to mess up to survive. Like evolution is just messy, fortuitous mess ups. So it's weird to sort of give non-biological things like computers attributes like language. We don't try to make computers photosynthesize or digest. So lastly, just real quick, I do talk about Ray Kurzweil and his sort of transhumanist friends for a bit in the article, who seem dedicated to maybe merging consciousness with machines or making some kind of super mind. And this obviously seems a little egotistical. I think these endeavors do seep into much of AI, you know, speech, facial recognition, chess, Jeopardy. These things we're already pretty good at. So it seems like we're building something that's sort of smart like us and not so interested in the possibilities of a new kind of intelligence. And my fear is that this intelligence circumscribed by a sort of STEM curriculum will not be very emancipatory. And if the new intelligence isn't emancipatory, why bother? That's my quick little elevator.
Love that. One of my favorite things about your chapter is that it starts with that joke, I don't have to drink alone because I have Alexa. And anyway, so really, really provocative. Okay, so can't wait to have more conversation about that. Next up in the chronology, so to speak, of the anthology is Avon Huxor's chapter called Artificial Intelligence, a Medium That Hides Its Nature. So Avon, if you can join us and give us your 3-minute pitch about your contribution.
Good afternoon, or at least good afternoon for those of us in Europe. Yeah, apologies in advance. Some people have already told that I've got just getting over COVID. So if you hear a throaty voice and coughing, I'll try and mute if I have a coughing attack. Okay, so my chapter, basically, so it's some work that Ariane kind of indicated this, I've been on and off doing for decades now, in that really I've been arguing that AI is really misunderstood. So the conventional view that everyone just takes for granted is that what it's trying to do is build intelligent autonomous machines, and it kind of falls or otherwise on those criteria. And it goes back to, in fact, you know, the kind of origin myths of modern AI in like the Turing test in Turing's original paper. And the thing trouble with that is that kind of idea colors everything that people do in AI. It affects the way people work in it, affects the way that members of the public receive it. Anyway, what I argue is actually that it's misunderstood itself, in that myth is kind of encouraged by the kind of interactions that AI scientists build around their tools. So what they tend to do for various reasons is, in fact, it relates to something that Scott's chapter kind of points to. So I'm very interested in dialogue with Scott on this later, is the way that dialogue and voice kind of encourage us to project agency on a technology. Because effectively it's historically and through evolutionary time, the only time that people engage in conversation and speak to anything is with our fellow humans. So it pulls all the triggers in our brains that say there's a person there, there's personhood, there's agency. So my argument is that sort of triggering of agency is kind of false. It's fooling us, in that really what's going on with AI technologies is that it's a medium. So it's a smart medium, but it's a medium in which people can encode and inscribe their thinking and their knowledge on and in a machine. Yeah. And it's a kind of a different sort of machine. It's different from a printing press. It's different from the cinema, but they're both technologies. And we have authors, makers, the medium, and people who read and engage in that text. And so that's very much what I'm arguing, is AI is effectively a computational surface that supports a smart medium. Yeah. So what's the benefit of doing this, taking this view? because I must admit, historically, it's kind of, I've had trouble with it because people in AI are kind of slightly averse to abandoning their original goals. So back in the 90s, when I first started doing this, I got very cold shoulders from computer science departments when I went to give seminars and so on. But that's kind of changed now, because historically AI was a minority activity. Yeah, so they could kind of isolate themselves from the world. But now that it's so prevalent, and there's a requirement for them to justify their activities out in the world, social sciences and people's humanities are rightly being engaged. And so, but on the more positive side, I don't want to say to my AI colleagues, if any are out there, is that this is it's sort of AI and its discontents is the title of the text. But this is like, for me, it's like word from a friend, a close friend in a pub. Yeah, is that I work in AI, I do it. So it's kind of saying there's a very powerful technology there. And if we design it in a way that facilitates this kind of communicative medium, then we can really offer something very new to the public. So anyway, yeah, and I'll stop there because I think I may have overrun.
That's all. Thanks. Yeah, I really appreciate that. You know, AI advice from a close friend. That's one of the things I think that's really wonderful about the kind of like optimism in your chapter and this new term, the smart medium that you coined. So I look forward to talking about that a little bit more. Next in the roster in our table of contents is Stephanie Allman, whose chapter is titled Gender Bias in Machine Translation Systems. So welcome, and it's over to you.
Thank you so much. So my chapter is based on kind of interdisciplinary work that we did here in Cambridge, kind of bringing together expertise from linguists, but also from the field of philosophy of language and engineering. And so I talk about the problem of bias, focusing specifically on gender bias, but of course other forms of bias can manifest as well. So we focus on gender bias in machine translation systems, such as Google Translate. And maybe to give a little bit of a background, there are different types of bias that we can identify in the context of AI systems. So I focus specifically on language-based AI systems. So of course, the types of bias that I'm using in this context, they can be extended for other AI applications. But for language-based AI, we focus on mainly 4 types of bias. First of all, the bias can of course be entailed in the training data itself. It can also be added during the annotation process. That might not be specifically relevant with regard to translation, but other applications such as hate speech detection, labeling of the data set is extremely important. And whoever does that can bring in biases, of course. Then bias can, of course, arise because the training data does not necessarily match the area or the domain where the algorithm or system is in the end applied. And then finally, of course, the model can amplify any existing bias in the data set itself. So in our study, we looked specifically at automated translations between English and German. That is mostly because gender is really interesting when you compare English and German and other languages as well, because German has a heavily gendered system, whereas English does not. So for example, if you wanted to translate a word like doctor into German, you would have to make a choice between the female or the male form, which also applies to the plural. And so what often happens still in a lot of these publicly available translation systems is that the male is usually chosen as the default or given as the default choice. And so we basically did 2 things. First of all, we looked at a sample of an actual training data set, and we did a corpus analysis. So looked at the distribution of different gendered words, such as nouns, occupation words, and pronouns, and looked at what's the distribution comparing male and female forms. And sadly, we did find that the results, most of them are skewed towards the male form, some towards the female form, but that kind of can be explained by the language actually. And then finally, we tested some different methods of trying to reduce or at least mitigate the bias that we find in the output of the translations. So we tried things like balancing the data by down or up sampling. So kind of making sure that we have a balanced amount of female and male forms in the data, which sadly did not really improve the results. And then we tried something like domain adaptation. So we basically took a much smaller data set that we could manually kind of prepare. So only a few hundred sentences. And we kind of used that to retrain the system after initial training on a larger data set. And we found that that actually did improve the results of the output, at least in terms of reducing the bias in the output. So that's it for now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's interesting to think about those kind of like reparative projects or kind of interventions. And also just on a personal note, as someone who's currently using Google Translate between English and German a great deal right now as I'm joining you from Berlin, your chapter has just been kind of circulating in the back of my mind, thinking about how much I'm saying that is already skewed by this machine translation. Okay, so last for today, in terms of our contributors, from the section on governance is Ranjini Raghavendra, who really wrote this like timely, in the moment chapter titled Controversial COVID-19 Tracing Apps in India, Digital Self-Defense, Governance, and Surveillance. Would love to hear more about that now, Ranjini.
Good evening. Thank you all for joining us here today. Yes, it was indeed in the moment. I remember writing to Ariane because I was struggling with COVID. My family was struggling, and I remember asking her for an extension deadline, and I wanted to write this chapter. So it was really in the moment in many ways. To give you all a bit of a context, the government of India in early April 2020 launched Arogya Setu, a contact tracing app aimed at tracking and controlling the spread of COVID-19. Arogya Setu in many Indian languages means bridge to being healthy. Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, in his address to the nation during the pandemic, made a request to the citizens to download this app. And it went on to become world's fastest growing app, beating Pokemon Go and the most downloaded healthcare mobile app with about more than 100 million downloads in just 40 days. So initially, when the Arogya Setu app was launched, it was purely voluntary. Downloading the app and using it was voluntary. But over a period of maybe a few days and weeks, it was made mandatory for the police, for the employees of the government, and then it was later on made mandatory for travelers. And this was in spite of it not being backed by law. So what happened was individuals and digital liberties groups opposed this, and petitions were filed in the court against mandating this. So in this paper, what I do is I try to analyze Arogya Setu app's ecosystem in terms of design, the manner in which it was deployed, privacy policy issues, and the frameworks for data protection. And what I suggest is that a techno-solutionistic kind of a very centralized approach is misplaced, and it yielded very limited kind of benefits on the ground during the pandemic. I'll talk about it in detail after some time. But what I try to do in this chapter is to try to demystify AI by describing its socio-technical, legal, political, ethical assemblage is what I attempt to do in this chapter. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think also, I think readers will really enjoy that you've taken such a kind of broad view about something that was really playing out on the ground, right? As you were reading about that, writing about that, and reading about it and studying it. And I think that is a really interesting way of thinking about it. And I think that's maybe where I want to kind of start actually kicking off our talk show portion of the evening here, is really, starting with you, Ranjini, thinking about like the outcomes, right? And we're kind of like moving into this endemic COVID world. There are all of these, what could have been considered maybe like failures or resistances. The security of the app data we're called into question at various times. And I'm just, I'm really curious to learn, are there kind of like takeaways that we can consider now that that we're like, a little bit further away? What can we learn about this demystifying process that you present to us, the way that these systems may or may not, or should not be used in future? What do you think now that you're kind of a few steps away now?
Yeah. Actuality of use was kind of very partial, I must say, for many reasons that, as I explained in the chapter. So the two important lessons from this is the backbone and the foundation for any contact tracing effort is health workers who work on the ground. So in India, door-to-door contact tracing was done by frontline health workers who are called ASHAs, accredited social health workers, and also Anganwadi workers who are involved in childcare, and also auxiliary nurses and midwives and others. So what happened was timely and efficient public health response will require supporting their work and strengthening their data collection, reporting mechanisms. But what happened on the ground was, here at one end we had Arogya Setu app and many other devices. But on the ground, even the health workers who came to my door, they were holding just a notebook, which they had to buy on their own. And it was not, they did not have any device. They were doing manual work, going from house to house. So the documentation was manual. And the reporting mechanisms was abysmally poor, particularly from rural India. We did not get to know what was happening in remote rural parts of India. So the main takeaways was that a more integrated approach, connecting this manual contacting tracing effort with the digital, which was very very ad hoc, and it was in technical silos, will be necessary to plan and prepare for future waves of pandemic.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I'm like just so excited to actually get to talk to you all, even online, to hear about all of those things, and the manual work that you just brought up really, I think, puts what you've just said now even, further clarifies the connections with Stephanie's chapter. about kind of like how sometimes there's that intersection between system development and also the manual kind of work, which is part and parcel to kind of like demystifying AI as this kind of reified tool or super intelligence or singularity, or what have you. So Stephanie, I wanted to ask you a bit about that. Like, you've done all of this great interdisciplinary work and kind of thinking about the encoded cultural biases. But of course, the kinds of suggestions that you have are these kinds of manual ways of shifting or intervening the human element in a sense, right? Like that, and I'm really just kind of interested into hearing a bit more about what kinds of things you think that we ought to be doing, in terms of
but it's their loss that
can you mute your
the format? I mean, remember that our format was also unusual. It could have been that as well.
There we go. Speaking of technology, yeah, perfect. So yeah, anyway, Stephanie, if you could just tell us a little bit more about the kinds of interactions that happen post facto, in a sense, when we're thinking about machine learning and machine translation specifically. Like, is it always going to have to be the post facto intervention? Like, what do you think?
I would say probably, because I mean, it kind of it raises a few questions for me or for us as a team when we worked on it. I mean, the first thing was, what do we even want and what is realistic? Do we want even a completely debiased data set? Is that realistic? I think it is. It depends on what the context is and what you want to use the system for. But then also, is it actually possible to completely get rid of any kind? I mean, and this is just gender. This is relatively simple to address in language compared to, let's say, racial bias, which can manifest in lots of other different ways. And I would say that, yes, for now, unless someone else has a better suggestion, I would say these kind of making adjustments or making changes after the initial training is kind of the only reliable way, because these systems require such large data sets for the initial training process, and it's just basically impossible to even know what's in those data sets and to use humans to actually evaluate the content. So I would say that it's impossible. So manually preparing a very small data set to kind of fine-tune a system once the initial training has happened is just at the moment much more likely and much more feasible.
That's really interesting. I think that really touches on something that Avon brought up, not only in his chapter, but also in the introductory remarks. And I think I might want to just call on you now as well. It just kind of thinking about the demystification that Ranjini's already brought up, the role of humans or authorship, whether it be of data sets or post facto adjustments. I think that that the way that you think about AI, Avon, like as a hidden nature in our worlds, I think it would be really helpful, I think, right now for you to maybe intervene and think a little bit more with us about what that smart medium is.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So I had some various thoughts on that. So first one, I tend to think through analogy and metaphor. Always have done. And so for me, an example of like what this hidden nature is I often think, if you see go to see a play, a theatre performance, and there's a character on stage, and and whatever the character might be, most of us don't actually think that the character is actually there. We understand that it is a performance. It's a product of the authorship of the playwright, mediated by the personal performance of the actor, who has their own interpretation, and of course the director. But we sort of go along with it effectively, And so partly that's what I think AI does. There's historical reasons why everyone wants to hide the mediated nature. Partly for the people in AI, it's because it has this kind of godlike goal that everyone is aiming towards. But for people who actually do, if you look at some of the things online, the chatbots, people kind of do know deep down that it's nothing behind the screen, but it's just playful. Much as you engage in a play, you just go along with it, or in a good film. So that's kind of how I see AI. And to kind of go slightly, segue slightly from that to address something that Stephanie was saying. See, my interpretation of what she's doing there is that she is co-authoring a text. So you and your team are, so basically you get, the idea that AI machine learning goes out and there's just stuff out in the world, you point a camera or a microphone and just suck it all in without, in some kind of way that's kind of unmediated, it just isn't there. You kind of curate, you select the data you're going to do, you might edit it down, you might throw out things that are just too awful to include. And so everyone involved in that process, and down to the people who actually do the coding at the end of the day, you're all kind of co-authors of this text. And so when it produces something at the end, you kind of, and I made a note here, use the phrase, it's the context in which it's used. And for me, that's effectively the same as writing for an audience. You have a kind of a perceived audience where, you have to decide whether to do this thing or not. And so that's the best way, I think, to understand it.
Oh, that's really interesting. So I'm going to give you a chance to respond to that afterwards, if that's all right, because I love that idea. And I think this is maybe a perfect time to bring it back to Scott's contribution, actually, because, as you started, as you've just said, Avon, and also in your introductory comments, like kind of thinking about that the person interacting in a sense with the machine is going along with it, or like, I love that theatrical analogy, and also like the agency involved in curating the data or using the data, going along with the data. And I think, maybe this comes back to the comments that they made in the beginning, right? Like Scott, when you were kind of thinking about, the notion of responsibility, and like thinking like, how do we think about responsibility when we think about it in the context of, trying to offload that responsibility in a world of certain types of relations, whether be they capital, neoliberal, etc. And so I kind of thought it would be really interesting to think about like responsibility in that way, so I used my Google Translate here in Berlin, and maybe I say something that I would never say, right? Because I try to be conscientious in my performance of what the AI tells me to do, right? But then, is it like, where does that, what's at stake there? Like, where does that fall? Because it's like, am I biased, or is the machine biased for telling me what to say to the person at the cashier, right? Like, I think that's one of the things I think is quite, interesting in the way you situate this, more culturally.
Right. My chapter, it's kind of, I guess the suggestion of it is that this current trajectory of AI is somewhat like a kind of voluntary deferral or abdication of agency, or like the responsibility for decision making. And it does seem like some of the dream of some AI advocates is this kind of autopilot world, which, Stephanie and Ranjini's invocation of the actual humans, makes it seem the autopilot idea is kind of a delusion. Well, I don't know, on the grander scale of like, there's plenty of sci-fi tropes about like, humans being made redundant or whatnot. But yeah, I'm a little bit more concerned about this kind of cultivation of a kind of willful naivety. Like the example where you say, I'm not racist, my human resources AI just really likes white men, hiring white men. This kind of like willful ignorance is, just ignorance about the repercussions of continuing to reproduce a colonizing society. seems kind of, I mean, that's my fear, is it seems just that's thus far is kind of AI's main, perhaps bug, I guess. You know, there's 400 years of Euro colonizers kind of retroactively saying, you know, sorry, we didn't know any better. Sorry for wiping out 50 million indigenous Americans, and sorry for hydraulic fracking. We didn't know any better. You know, this, you know, I kind of think modernity can be kind of replaced with naivety. We're in the naive period, late naivety. You know, we're just so good at blinding ourselves to the kind of negative repercussions of our actions. And my AI dystopia is kind of this AI as a technology for further sort of distancing or shielding us from the exploitation of the sort of status quo. Yeah, the abdication of agency, to get back to that. You know, I mean, generally, I think it's there's a fear that we kind of make ourselves a bit more pliable to the algorithms or whatnot. But there's that guy, there's Evgeny Morozov. He has this. He's sort of cautioned against sort of relying on any kind of tech fixes like our Google Translate, like I used in Germany for 6 months. Just as abandoning sort of agency kind of further alienates humans from the sort of idea that we're capable of enacting change through like politics or political organization or action. So, I mean, you know, as we've heard, humans are still entirely necessary for this AI apparatus. And yeah, the deferral of agency is a concern that comes up a lot in my paper. And yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's yeah, just this fear that we might defer the possibility of actually enacting any kind of political solutions to our problems, and hoping for you know, the technological solution, I guess, is sort of where I go down in my fear of deferral of agency or abdication, I guess.
I feel like you should write to Bruno Latour. It's not that we've never been modern; it's that we're just naive moderns.
Exactly.
Yeah. No. I appreciate that. Yeah. Really interesting thought. You know, just like a really interesting thought, right? To kind of think about the way that technology is, in one sense, you know, this, you know, optimistic medium, the way that Avon describes it, and in the other sense, like this kind of catch-all tool that's supposed to solve all of our problems, you know, and your worries about that, I think, resonate most likely a great deal, especially when we're thinking about like kind of like apathy of the world around passive consumption and these kinds of things. And I think I wanted to actually ask about a little bit more about surveillance. So I feel like I'm kind of hard lefting out of this conversation. I guess pun intended, in terms of the left there. Yeah, Ranjini, your chapter really has a subsection where you're talking a little bit more about surveillance, and thinking about how surveillance in a sense is necessary, right? We need some kind of tool, not only to contact trace in the midst of a crisis, but also kind of like there has to be some data input, or rather observed training, you know, the machine in a particular way. And again, I feel like I'm now floating in the world of metaphor, thanks to Avon's comments there. But I'm just really curious about, you know, what you thought about AS, like what you thought the apps, you know, maybe like the upshots there, like, you know, is there something you would have liked to talk about more in terms of surveillance? You know, it was one part of that ecosystem that you describe in the chapter, but, you know, I'd be really curious to hear, you know, if you have had any further thoughts or some other things that you wanted to discuss, whether it was about cultural biases and surveillance, or, you know, machine surveillance of humans. You know, I just wanted to kind of welcome that, since that's a hot topic, right? Thinking about the machines that watch us.
Yeah, it was a bit difficult initially, because surveillance as such is seen as something very negative. But what I tried to do in the chapter is to bring in a distinction about the perception of surveillance in the medical discourse is very different from the general approach. Generally, we see surveillance as something negative. What I have tried to do is offer a very nuanced approach to unpacking surveillance. Surveillance in medical discourse involves kind of fundamentally mapping the spaces of illnesses and maybe by who is mapping it? Is it the state, the public health officials, the community, and how are they doing it? It could be self-tracking or manually tracking by the health workers or others whom I talked about earlier. So it then becomes important to acknowledge that stark differences in the different positions on surveillance in terms of harm and in terms of care. In public health, surveillance has a different approach and meaning, and it becomes important in a situation like this when we have a pandemic. So I have tried to approach it in two different ways in the chapter. Should I also talk about the biases?
That would be one. Yeah, I would love to hear about that too. I know it was kind of a double question, so yeah, please do.
Yeah. So what bothered me about the Arogya Setu app was that it catered to the urban, literate, English, educated, kind of elite population, totally the poor, the migrant were totally excluded, at least in the initial versions. Those who are marginalized, tribals who did not have access to this kind of a technology, and the elderly who did not have, who do not use mobiles. So this was what bothered me about the biases.
Yeah, I think that brings us right back to all of the things that, like that Stephanie also mentioned as well, right? Like the idea that there's kind of like these assumptions that are within the data or within the app design, within the system that, that are kind of like intervened upon. But I also wanted to ask you, Stephanie, I had this like strange question that I really wanted to ask you about surveillance, and I was kind of like putting on my like Fox News hat, like the idea that like we shouldn't intervene with the, the sacred space of the internet and these data sets and like the development of AI, like, like these like kind of like the haven of free speech online or something like that. And yet they're often the places that AI training, can find these vast amount of data sets. They comb, like Google reads your emails. That's how it learns, right? It learns. So yeah, I had this kind of like really strange question for you, right? Like thinking about the relationship between kind of like the surveillance of these things like, say, Google Translate, but also how, how that relates to the kinds of, algorithmic optimization, like that you're trying to kind of intervene on. So, a bit out of left field, but really just curious to, hear whether that was something that you discussed in your interdisciplinary team or whether you have thoughts about that going forward with your counter-speech project.
Yeah, that's interesting. To be completely honest, I hadn't considered it until you kind of gave me the question. And I thought, surveillance, of course, that must play a role in machine translation as well. Because why wouldn't it? Everything. Yeah, I mean, of course, if you use Google Translate, if you use Amazon Translate, or if you use translation on your iPhone, your data will get stored and it will be used, as you said, for any kind of algorithm to learn more about what you are interested in, what your behavior is. There are translation systems that are more secure and more encrypted. So something like Systran is not comparable or not identical with something that is just as popular as Google Translate. And I was thinking, from a user perspective, how much do I personally care if Google knows what I'm trying to translate? maybe not so much, but then I was thinking we use automated translation more and more in medical contexts to help communication, you know, for immigrants, for refugees, to provide them with care, and often that is of course helped by these translation systems, but also we're handling extremely sensitive data. And so I'm not sure what medical professionals, what they use specifically, if they have special technology that they use, or if they just go to Google Translate. But these are sort of areas where I would be a bit more concerned and think, you know, this is data that you might not want Google to know and use.
Oh, that's a really interesting, yeah, that's such an interesting point that you brought up. I mean, you know, as some of you may know, my interests are in the health field and health professions, and I think that's actually a really interesting, maybe a segue back to Scott, actually. You know, kind of thinking about the conversations with machines. You know, at least in Canada, they try to find human translators in those kinds of medical contexts where possible. But I imagine that as, you know, as we develop these smart media that are able to have to actually mediate in those situations, you know, that kind of raises some of the issues that you've already brought up, Scott. But this question that I, you know, had kind of on my mind for you was kind of thinking about the uncanny like elements of that anthropomorphizing, and of course hoping to, you know, bring it back to Avon and then open it up to the audience there as well. But you know, a lot of the development of AI and robotics has been about trying to, you know, whether it's the Turing test to like trick us into thinking we're having a conversation with a human being, or, you know, developing Eliza, or developing, you know, these robots that, or chat bots, right? That, but there's always like something a little bit uncanny, right? Like something that doesn't quite fit. Yeah, and so, you know, so I'm just kind of coming back to that point that you made just at the end there. So kind of, you know, just thinking about how that might play a role in the kind of alienation that you're kind of talking about, or whether that's liberating. Maybe the uncanny is kind of a, you know, a moment of intervention, of thinking otherwise, of, I don't know, you know, I know it's a difficult word these days, but like decolonize, or you know, maybe there's something unsettling there. I'm not sure if you had any, you know, kind of thoughts about that discomfort with the machine.
Yeah, I mean, as Avon said, I think everyone has kind of been aware that, you know, there's something about language, and Stephanie and Avon, you know, bring up that GPT-3, the latest and greatest kind of language simulator. And yeah, I mean, I do think I'm totally fascinated by some of the points that Avon brings up about the authorial kind of a voice there too, which would be fun to talk about. But yeah, I mean, definitely, you know, I think there's something pretty evocative about language that, and Avon said it too, that, you know, there's something like it triggers some kind of empathy or something. You know, in the chapter I talk about language as being a sort of a prerequisite for sort of the like intention or blame for whatever, rightly or wrongly. It's sort of how it's kind of perceived. You know, if your drink is spilled by a dumb waiter being broken, you know, you don't blame it usually. You might even suggest that you mishandled it. But, you know, if there's a talking AI and it gets your order wrong, you know, you might think that it's being disobedient or mistaken. If you get like a flat tire, you know, you don't necessarily say your bike is mistaken. You might say it's broken. So yeah, I think there's some kind of empathy that comes with, you know, language users, if that's another human or some kind of voice emulator. I know a little bit of left field here, but I do kind of sometimes, I kind of think, you know, there's this anthropomorphizing thing that goes on with the computers, with the AI a little bit, or at least our trajectory of AI. And it kind of weirdly just it reminds me of, or it makes me think of how we often portray even like aliens, in pop culture. We weirdly like anthropomorphize aliens, on our sci-fi, on our TV shows and stuff. I think it's kind of for a similar reason. I think there's like the search for AI and kind of this building of, or the search for extraterrestrials and the creation of AI is kind of similarly motivated in some sense. It's kind of somewhat a loneliness, but maybe more so a desire to find someone or something, that maybe has more answers for us or can save us from ourselves. If maybe because we can't or don't want to sort of see our way out of this current trajectory of potentially looming crises. I don't know. I think there's some sort of element of wanting to relate, and there's obviously like the uncanny valley can be pretty jarring, but apparently like I've looked at some of the GPT-3 stuff, and it's not. Some of the examples I've seen of it seem beyond, like they're not even uncanny. It's uncanny because you know what it is, but if you didn't know what it was, it could possibly pass its Turing tests. So I don't know. I feel like there's some motivating desire to connect, or almost like we're kind of wanting some kind of paternalism or something along those lines. I don't know. That's kind of where I was thinking with that.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. I also, I feel you on the, on the like living in this world right now, and kind of looking for something to save us from ourselves. I think that's an interesting turn of phrase. But on that pessimistic note, we turn to Avon for just to maybe, I want to just pick up on one more thread there, but I do want to say to those of us who are joining us, the audience, please, do use the chat function to write your question. If you do have something you'd like to ask yourself, feel free to just write, I have a question. If you're a student or an early career researcher, please indicate that, because we're going to turn it over to you in a few minutes. So Avon, I just wanted to kind of ask that last kind of, question, raising the notions of the medium, that authorial voice, like picking up on what Scott kind of started by saying. And also, thinking about what kind of future you envision around also the authority of that voice, right? Like you talked about the mediums as kind of being situated and mediating between author and user and design and development. And I was just, I was just curious whether there were, any kind of closing ideas that you had, and after this discussion, kind of thinking about not only the notion of the voice, the anthropomorphized voice, but also then authority and responsibility, the same ways that those threads have been picked up by the others.
Well, I was going to, I made a few notes actually. So one thing that springs to mind is, since I wrote the chapter, I've given a few presentations, and I got a very good question from somebody, which I think was well spotted. And effectively, it was because most AI systems, because they're so complicated, they involve, as Stephanie can attest, many people. You get sort of, it's like a Wikipedia page where normally there's like dozens of authors. And so the kind of authorial voice is often not obvious. And it's easier then to abstract it into having its own sense of agency. And that's very different from our normal view. So if we tend to think of the written word, you tend to think of the great novel with a singular authorial voice. And there you see the author crystal clear. And when it's this kind of messy, multi-authorial thing, I think it's then easier for us to not see it. Yeah. And then also what is the other thing, of course, is I think when I read Scott's chapter, it really sort of like was very instructive to me, because I've always wondered, there's various reasons why people are happy to attribute agency to AI. One is, as we were saying, there is a kind of evolutionary thing we just do. You see a piece of string around the back of the sofa as a cat's tail because you're expecting it, and it's a sort of cognitive version of that. The other one is the playfulness, the going to the theatre and just like, it's not real, this chatbot, but why the hell not engage in it? But then I think Scott's idea that sometimes we go along with it because it gives us a let out from taking responsibility of the systems we build and systems we use, I think is really well observed, and one that I'm going to sort of take on board. And I suppose the final thing I wanted to add in response to Scott's response to everything was this when AI fails, how we see it. And funny enough, I think there's some evidence. So if a computer system does it all perfectly, people tend not to market it as AI. Yeah, it becomes an algorithm. It's a job done. Whereas if it doesn't do it properly, because people make mistakes, and so ironically, when they get it slightly wrong, we're more likely to see it as an agent because it's more human. So faults are actually crucial, I think, in the working. And because AI is always constantly in development, things like, so expert systems, when I had some hair that wasn't great, and I worked on in the mid 80s, they were very unreliable and they didn't work, and it seemed like AI. Eventually, they're now just called business rules or something, and they're not sold as AI. They're just some technology that you can get from SAP or whatever. And this is it. AI is always chasing its own tail into the realm of the undoable.
Oh, so many good turns of phrase in this today. Chasing its tail into the realm of the undoable. That's really exciting. I think as we kind of move towards the Q&A, we will of course stop recording. I want to thank our speakers again for being on the spot for my questions and hopefully of interest in terms of thinking with the other contributors in the anthology.